Hi, I'm Kathy Rushing, host of the podcast Committed, The Entrepreneur Marriage. If your middle name is Restless and you identify with words like innovator, dreamer, changemaker, creative, independent, or you are married to an entrepreneur, or heaven help you, you're both entrepreneurs, this podcast is for you. The entrepreneurial journey can be a little wild at times, like uncharted territory. Join me as I talk with others who are at various stages of developing their business or project. We'll explore the wisdom and insights they have gained while navigating the ups and downs of the entrepreneur journey. You'll discover that there are many couples who have found ways to thrive in both their business and their marriage. Today's episode is the very first interview of the Committed podcast, and I could not have asked for a more gracious couple. Doug and Cristie Martine said yes to this project that was little more than an idea in my head at the time. Their story illustrates so beautifully the commitment to being partners in life and work, held together by their unwavering commitment as people of faith. They linked hands and hearts as they faced some serious physical and emotional challenges that Cristie had secretly been struggling with when they were dating. You'll hear how Doug moved from rising through the ranks but rotting away on the inside, and finally decided to start his own construction management business. He launched just 2 years before the Great Recession of 2008, when they were adopting internationally at the same time. Life was challenging and full, but they did what they had to do to make the dream a reality. This episode was a goldmine of wisdom. I hope you enjoy meeting the Martines as much as I did. Doug and Cristie, thank you so much for joining me on this very first episode of the Committed podcast. Every story has a beginning. Tell us a little bit about how you guys met. And we'll start with the marriage piece, maybe a little history.
Sure.
And then we'll move into business, and then we'll go back and forth.
So I'll start. And
do you want your version or my version?
Well, I'll give you my version. So
I want both versions.
Cristie and I both went to Texas A&M. And
Gig 'em.
Gig 'em.
Both class of 96. So it was probably our senior year of A&M. And my story is I had seen her on campus for about 3 years or 4 years. And, I always saw her as the girl I wanted to meet, but she never gave me the time of day.
He was a letterhead.
And so years went by, and we were spending more and more time. Like she actually worked in the rec center, and I would go there and work out with friends. And so I crossed our paths crossed several times. And then one night we were out at a dance hall together, not together, but with mutual friends, and asked her to dance, and we did. And I had a girlfriend at the time, and so it was kind of awkward for her. It's just weird, but anyway, long story short, we started dating. And at Texas A&M, and through our graduation, and moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Got married about a year after graduation, about a year. Yeah. We graduated in May, I graduated in May, and then we got married the following March, and the rest is history. It's that easy. Right?
There's version one.
Right.
So you guys have been married how long?
20 years.
20 years.
It was
Congratulations.
20 years it was 98, so it was 20 years of March of 18.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, right at 20 years.
Cristie, what would you add?
So he always talks about having seen me on campus. I don't ever recall a time of seeing this cute boy on campus. Mm-hmm. But I do, I remember when I first started seeing him, I was working at the rec center, and I would work out. And I would go in real early in the morning and run. And I remember seeing him on like the little lat pull down machine, thinking he was kind of cute, and showed up at the Silver Wings Ballroom for a Jerry Jeff Walker concert. And several of my friends were guys, so my best friends, and I had a girlfriend that was one of my little sisters, my sorority, and we kind of dumped the guys and said, we're going to go walking because if you're by us, we're not going to get asked to dance. And as I kind of rounded the place, I saw Doug walking in with a group of people, and I positioned myself in such a way that he was pretty much going to fall over me if he didn't ask me to dance. But the ironic thing is his cousin actually asked me to dance first. And so I danced with his cousin and then ended up dancing with Doug the rest of the night. But when we left, he didn't get my phone number. And my dear friend, gentleman boy, said, he didn't get your phone number because he's dating somebody. If he didn't get your phone number. And I didn't believe him. And I went to the sorority house on a Monday for a meeting. And there was on like the wall a picture of Doug and this other girl, my one of my sorority sisters, and I said, "Who is that?" And she said, "Oh, that's Doug Martine." And it wasn't her in the picture; it was like another mutual friend. And I said, "Oh, I met him the other night. Such a nice guy." And she went on and raved about how wonderful Doug Martine was. And I said, "I want to ask him to our upcoming formal." And she said, "Oh, he has a girlfriend." So that's kind of how we first met, and I would see him in the rec center after that for a long, couple months before he then broke up with his girlfriend and asked me on a date. So.
Oh, okay. So it took him a little while to, get up the courage, Doug, or pay attention?
No,
or?
it was just the timing was right, I
Okay.
guess. And I was free, so the next day I went and asked her to lunch. So and that was our senior. That was our senior year, our fourth year at A&M.
Yeah. So what was the attraction? What was the draw to each other as you did start paying attention and dating
from my perspective, I was heavily involved in Young Life, and at A&M, Texas A&M, there's something called Breakaway, where a guy named Greg Mott started it. So I was involved. I was actually in an organization with Greg Mott called Aggie Men's Club.
Okay.
And so what I think the initial attraction was, we saw each other. We thought each other was cute. Obviously, that's what happens. But after we dated, we started dating. I think that's really what gelled us, is we saw, and now we were in college. I wouldn't say that we were making all the right choices or spiritually mature at the time, but we both had that grounding. And she'll probably tell more of her story, but for me, it was, I wasn't looking for a party girl. I was looking for a girl with her faith as her foundation, something we could build on. We were both outdoors. We both like athletics. We're both very active. And I think that was beyond all the superficial things. I think that was what gave us the staying power. Even at that age, we'd go to Breakaway together.
And even the attraction, you knew that your faith was important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it was on our first date, and she'll probably tell it, but I think one of the things that she really learned was, but we went to dinner and our first lunch, and I prayed over the meal. And she said, and at that instant, she knew something was different. And I think that was foundational for us even at that age. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Cristie, what would you say? What drew you to Doug?
I would definitely say when I met Doug, and I always say that he always said he would see me on campus. I would say I didn't see him on campus, although looking back, I can actually remember times of meeting him. But I think the Lord blinded my eyes because I was not ready. I was not in the place that Doug was. And though I'd been raised in a home that had gone to church, I didn't know what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus. And it wasn't until that senior year that I began going to Breakaway, and my life really began to change. I had dated somebody prior to Doug for about 10 months, and he had a faith, and I was never included in that faith. And so we would go to church, or we would go on a date, and he would pray, but I wasn't invited into that. And I always felt like, wow, like I know looking back, I was searching for something. And then when I began to go the Breakaway and have my own relationship with Jesus, when I met Doug and we went on the very first lunch, Olive Garden, and he reached across the table and held my hand and asked if he wanted to pray. And I remember thinking, like, there's something really different about him. Like, I was invited into this, and so that definitely. And so I always say, in a marriage, I think that the men are made and created to be the spiritual leader. For me, that was very much the truth, because I was young in my faith when I met Doug.
Okay.
I was getting involved and I was in a Bible study and whatever. But when I met Doug, I was young in my faith. And so he really began to teach me. And was really so I've grown in my faith with Doug.
So you grew in many ways together.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. What was the process of knowing that you were each other's forever person?
So, do you want to give your testimony, or?
Sure. We have gone the gamut.
I'll let you share it, and then I'll.
When I met Doug, I was struggling with an eating disorder that nobody knew about, and I think my parents had inklings of. And we were about months into dating, not very long into dating. And I just remember I'd had a really hard day and being on the phone with Doug, and he wanted to come by and see me or something. And I was really upset. And I said, I just remember saying to him, I can't tell you over the phone what's going on. And he was like, okay, I'm on my way over. And I remember hanging up the phone and thinking to myself, oh, crud. What am I going to tell this guy? He's just summoned him over to my apartment, and I was kind of at the rock bottom. And that night, I told Doug, the first person ever, that I was struggling with an eating disorder. And
that's huge. He
called my parents, we called together, called my parents. My parents were down within that next day. And I really started counseling within the next week.
Wonderful.
And I graduated a semester before he did, and I stayed in College Station because I was with a wonderful counselor and I wasn't ready to move on. And so through that journey of counseling, he was there with me. He was my teammate. And looking back, for me, we have a very different look at the beginning of marriage because it was really hard on him. He didn't know what he had gotten into. For me, it was the first time I had hope out of a very dark place.
Yes.
And so that, for me, I learned a lot about who Doug was in the midst of we started our relationship with me in a trial.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
And that was hard so my side of that is, here I am, a 20-year-old college kid, and I'm getting this news that I'm like, okay. And, I didn't know what to do with that other than, look, I'm here.
Did you even know what an eating disorder was
I knew,
at the time?
What an average person would, but I don't know. I didn't know the depths of stronghold that came, that stemmed from. And so I just remember being like, look, I'm here. And I remember I always told you, I'm your teammate. I may not be able to help you because I'm not professional, that's for other people, but I'm here with you. And I think that was, and I will say there were some pretty dark times through our dating, through our engagement. And it wasn't until probably 2 years into our marriage, give or take.
No, I would say a year into our marriage, we got pregnant with Canyon, our oldest.
Yeah.
And we were at a really large church in Arlington. I remember writing the letter to the senior pastor because I remember looking around a church and seeing all these beautiful women and knowing that eating disorders are rampant in type A-driven women. And I looked around this church and I thought, I'm not alone in this. Yeah. And ended up leading a ministry there for some time. And that was about the time that I got pregnant with Canyon, my oldest. And even now I would say, I don't know, definitely it was just a victory in Christ of me overcoming that. But that was kind of for me, I remember that in my time in my life, that was the proof that I had conquered that, was that I could go through a pregnancy and
oh my goodness, yes. Talk about body image changes and
and embraced it.
And from a marriage standpoint, this is, how, it was our engagement and our marriage for me was, here I am, again, I'm 21, we got married 23. At 23, it was when we actually got married.
Right.
And I'm helping this woman I don't really know all that well yet through the biggest trial of her life. And so the emotions that came with that, I did not come from a family with a lot of emotions. And so this was all brand new to me. And there was some wounding. There was wounding that happened to me. I wouldn't say wounding as much as, what am I getting myself into here? I can't handle this. Is this what marriage is going to be like?
Some hesitation maybe?
But that's what I was going to, respond to your question by how did I know? And all I can say is God just said, it's your wife. This is who it is. And so no matter what emotions, no matter how I felt, again, there were some dark times walking through that with her. I just knew that like, I'm not going anywhere, no matter how bad it gets.
Wow.
And we didn't know there was going to be freedom. You just never know when you're going through a trial. So it was just that word from God that just basically was like, this is who I've chosen for you. And you're to be there, you're to be a teammate, and you won't understand it. And so it's funny when she tells her side, it's more of a story of hope. My side is more of a story of desperation. Like, what the heck have I gotten into? Like, okay, and just hang on and ride this out. And to add to what Cristie said, I mean, it was a pretty miraculous thing. A lot of people come out of something like that, but it's still a constant struggle. With her, it was complete and utter freedom.
That is amazing.
And to the point where we often talk about it, where it's like she came out of that and it was obvious why she went through it based on who she has helped since then with those types of issues. And you can't understand that until you've been through it.
Right.
And she's been through it. She's seen the dark side. I've seen the dark side because I can speak to a husband. And so I think that was sort of trial by fire. And then when you come out of something like that, that helps solidify us in a lot of ways. If that makes sense.
And I love what you both have referenced in terms of you were a team, because I think that is so much a part of a thriving marriage. Is there are no perfect marriages.
Right.
I haven't found one yet anyway. But, when you lock hands and hearts and say, we are a team, no matter what, there's not a plan B. And so whatever comes, we're in it together, because I think that is just so powerful, and that gives couples the strength when those hard times
And this started before we were married. So really,
you didn't have to commit.
I could have said, hey, I'm not signing up for this.
Exactly.
And that never seriously crossed my mind anyway. But God sort of intervened anyway before I even thought that, and said, no, this is your route. This is your path.
Yeah.
And so it's more of a testimony to that than it is to anything I decided or that she went through. It's how God sort of held us in his hand during that time.
I love that image.
Yeah.
Love that image. And a reminder too that we take someone with all of their good characteristics and all of their flaws. And we don't get to pick and choose. Well, I'm going to stay with you as long as it's easy. I mean, obviously a lot of people do that, and that's part of why the divorce rate is still somewhere around 50%.
Yeah,
but
you would think about 3 months into a relationship, he would have run. I mean, looking back, and even as a mom, and I've got 4 kids, what would I tell my own kids? I mean, I wouldn't wish upon any of my 4 children what Doug had to walk through with me.
Right.
And I do think that when you walk through that, even going into a marriage, then you're like, okay, we've been through a really deep, dark place together, and we can get through that. We've seen that there's victory in that. We can.
Right. Yeah. And not just get through it, but I'm sure you came through it stronger, learning a lot more. Victory. And more about yourself, about, God's presence in your marriage, which is something many marriages don't have. That's an awesome story. So when you first got married, what did the future look like, especially regarding work or purpose?
So I am a very disciplined, pretty status quo, the way I look at life. So I hired on to a large company, and I had the...
And just real briefly, Doug,
Yes.
what did you come out of college with?
I graduated with a degree in construction science.
Okay.
And I went to work for a large commercial contractor.
Okay.
First in the Arlington, around Dallas-Fort Worth. And then as we had our first son, we wanted to move closer to family. So that's when we relocated to San Antonio.
Okay.
So I got hired on. I got a job with a large builder in San Antonio. And so I had, from a work standpoint, I was I'm going to move up in a company. I'm going to be vice president. I'm going to retire. I had a very linear outlook on my career, and almost to the point where I could predict where I was going to be, when I was going to be. And at this point in life, we can build our retirement home. And so work for me, I worked very hard, but family was always important. So I was not a late night guy. I was usually home by dinner time, and I was very efficient to do that. And so I learned to work efficient and to work hard and to get your work done and come home. But for me, to answer your question, it was a very linear path to retirement.
He didn't come out of college. I don't ever remember a time him saying, when I grow up, or, one day I want to own a business. I actually think I remember you saying, I don't want to own a business, if I can remember correctly. But I remember thinking that, he's going to, like he said, work his way up, and, he'd get his yearly evaluations or whatever. And, it was, what was the next step to get to the,
So a fairly traditional,
very traditional model,
predictable work path. And what about you, Cristie? When you came out of college,
so I came out with a degree and went right back in and I came out with a degree in nutrition.
Okay.
And I went right back in.
Oh, that's interesting. Given
right,
and did your eating disorder play into that?
I think so,
decision?
very much. I think I actually would think yes. I think I chose something that I was interested and focused on at the time. And when I came out, I actually went on and got my education degree. So I left A&M. We moved to Arlington. He was in one apartment. I was in another apartment. He started his first job, and I went back to school and got my certification to teach at an elementary level. So I was hired on after when we were first got married. I was just hired on to teach second grade. And I guess I got hired, midsummer to start that would be my first job. I started my first job, and October of that first year, my very first teaching year, I found out I was pregnant.
Okay.
And so, now what? We both knew that we wanted me to stay at home, and that was our goal, is me to be home with our kids. I can remember, in order for me to stay home, we needed $400 extra a month for me to get off of the insurance I had with the school, get on Doug's insurance and put the baby on. And I had to let the school know by a certain time when I was coming back. And it was the end of the school year, and he got a pay raise for $401 a month.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So,
I love it.
So I stayed home.
Okay.
I've had odd different jobs throughout the years since then, did some real estate, did some other things, but.
Okay.
And she currently helps me with the books on my business. So she's not technically working.
I'm the highest paid volunteer.
Yeah. That's what I call it.
With some benefits, hopefully.
Right. That's right.
So you didn't start out, Doug, thinking that you were going to have your own company. You said don't want to, actually. So tell us a little bit about what you do now and how that came about.
So I rose up in the ranks pretty quickly. I was offered shares in the company of the large company I was working for at the time. And I was battling contentment, as I think a lot of men do. A lot of men have everything that they should have, but they're still bored stiff and they don't know why. And that was me. And so what I began to do was I dug into that through different books and through different things that I was seeking. I started really picking at the scab, I guess you could say. And so going through that, I began to ask, okay, why am I not happy? I've got a great job, a perfect wife. At the time we had, I always tell people now looking back, I had my little house in the suburbs. I had my pretty little wife, my 2.5 kids, my SUV, and I've got everything that the American family should have, but I was rotting away on the inside. And it wasn't miserable, but I just wasn't content. And so I had begun to investigate new business opportunities. And I think what spurned in me was wanting to, basically, I started that desire of wanting to work for myself. I wanted to, if I was going to be making somebody money, why wouldn't it be me? Instead of getting paid what they felt like I was worth.
So that was just a shift that you made out of some restlessness, not necessarily modeled like
Yes.
Did either of your parents, were
No.
they entrepreneurs?
No, this was not modeled by anybody.
Okay.
And some of the things I was going through a lot of John Eldridge books, a lot of stuff, and it was more of a faith journey for me.
Okay.
Because our family took a similar transition where we had our pretty kids. We were thinking about our third child, and God opened up the door to adoption. And so our family did a complete about face, and our second two children are adopted.
Okay.
So that's been a whole nother transition. But on the work front, it was the same thing. And I remember I took the firefighters test for San Antonio and Austin.
Really?
And did really well, but for some reason my number wasn't called. And so I was looking for something that I could find meaning behind, something that I truly enjoy doing, where I could mesh my values and my work ethic and make a living in doing something I wanted to do. And my current job was not offering that. And it's not a knock on them. It was a great company. It was on me.
Right.
And,
You were unsettled.
So I remember one time coming home and whining and moaning about it as I did during this period, and Cristie finally just said, "Look, I'm done. Either quit or shut up about it." And she kind of gave me the ultimatum, like, "Look, I'm behind you. If you want to lead," because I had a lead on if I were to quit and do my own business, I had already a lead on some work that I could do. So it wasn't jumping off a cliff and trying to grab a branch. There was actually a rock to land on.
Okay.
And so a client base, I guess you could say. And so she kind of gave me the ultimatum, said, "I'm done. Either quit crying about it and quit griping about it. If you want to do it, do it." And that's when I basically, in a lot of the books I was reading, was telling me the same thing, that the only one can change your situation is you. If you don't like it, then change it. You got one life to live. If you want to do it, do it. And I remember thinking, well, what's the worst that can happen?
That is a loaded question.
I go get another job. If it fails and we take a little dip, fine, I'll go get a job and we'll be right back where we are. And so culmination of that, I went in and I remember one day God said, "Do it." And I went in and turned in my 2 weeks notice and started my own business at that point. Yeah.
And so what business did you land on, or what did you start?
Working on the general contracting side, and I started my own company, basically doing real estate development and construction management. So I became a guy that basically manages real estate development projects for other developers, and with the long-term goal of being my own developer someday. And so, that takes investors and money and everything that comes with it, which I did not have at the time. But that was my ultimate goal. And I wanted to get out of construction and more into development and real estate.
Okay.
And so that's the business that I started.
Fascinating. And so from a timeline perspective, when you adopted your first child, which would be your third child, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Where does that fall in line with when you started?
That's funny. He left his company in May, and we found out, she's adopted from China, so we found out who she was in the summer after that, and we traveled to bring her home in September.
Oh my goodness.
But it
So
was 2 years of work
we
prior
had,
to that.
yeah,
So we
it
had
had
been
been,
working on it for 2
it was
years.
a 23, 27 month process total. So it was right in the middle.
So it all
my parents were
culminated.
probably thinking we're going to have to move them in, financially support them. What are they thinking?
That would be interesting to go back and ask them.
Right.
Yes. So and it seems that it goes that way a lot of times. There's not one transition, there are multiple transitions. So when was this that you started the company, Doug?
May of 06.
06.
2006.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Is when I left my company, and yes, it was May of 2006.
And can you give us kind of a brief timeline from 2006 to now?
Sure.
I'm sure there's much that has happened, but just for our listeners, kind of give us an overview of what that trajectory, I can say that, looks like.
Well, I started a real estate development construction management company in 2006, just prior to 07 and 08, and everybody knows
Great
what
years.
happened.
Yes.
Exactly.
If only we could predict the future.
Exactly. So for me, it has been a an up and down road, but mostly in a good way. I equate it to the stock market where it's constantly up and down, but when you look at the long term, the net gains have been fantastic.
Okay, that's a great perspective.
And so, it turned into I had a client base to go to, which as soon as 2008 hit, they disbanded. And I was basically looking around going, okay, what am I going to do for a living now? Still have my company, and I had a lot of contacts and built up a lot of relationships. So to combine the faith journey with my entrepreneurship, it was almost like we would just pray and say, Lord, just lead us. Just where am I supposed to go? And then it was almost, we tell the testimony, it's almost like it was Christmas there for about 6 months where I would meet someone for lunch and there was a new opportunity. I was introduced, well, I wasn't introduced, but I started thinking about a state license to do ADA consulting, which I have hired these consultants my entire career. And I began to think, well, I probably know it as well as they do. And so I made a call to the state, got the license within 2 months, and that began a whole new platform of business.
Okay.
And so for me, I became extremely diversified. So I started working for developers. I started working with banks, doing odd things that banks needed on investment properties. I worked for clients to do ADA consulting on different projects. I always joked with people during that time, hey, if you need your toilets washed, call me.
I will do
if you'll pay me,
anything.
I'll do it.
Yes.
But there was always, as hard of time as it was, and here's my other analogy, it was like looking across a river, and I wanted to be on the other side of the river, and God never provided that path, but He always provided a rock to jump on. So I could always jump to this, and we never, yes, we had up and down financial months, but we never did without.
Right.
You know, we always had what we needed. And it was like every time we turned around, a new opportunity would come up, and it would be some sort of weird, hey, can you do this for me? We'll pay you. Sure. Because again, this is 12 years of sort of culmination, right? Till today. I did so many odd things for different people in and around real estate development and construction and investments and banking that looking back on it, what I'm doing now with my own partners, developing new projects as an owner, everything that I did brought me to this point. So I guess what I'm trying to say is
Gave him the experience and the knowledge to do what he's doing.
Yeah, the long road that I did, all these odd jobs. I'm like, why am I doing this? I could be a president. I could be VP of a company by now. And here I am doing
Have
this
a regular paycheck.
Yeah. But with what I'm doing now, it's kind of culminating. All of that experience is the people I'm hiring now. And so everybody I've hired, I've done their job. And so now I can manage those people well because I've been where they are and I know what they're doing.
He has built good relationships.
And I've built relationships with them. And so I look back, I'm like, isn't it weird how I always wondered how and why I was doing all these different things, and cobbled together, they were making a pretty good living, right? Not one of them was enough to support, so I kind of had to do everything to a point. Even starting it's another show, but starting a coffee roasting business with some partners and trying to get that
Now
growing.
you're speaking my love language.
And that fell, but what I've learned through that with entrepreneurship and getting it, it's all of that has culminated to what I'm doing now. And so it's kind of a cliche, but it's so true in our experience where the cliche is so true because I wouldn't be where I was without the desert, if that makes sense. And it was in the desert that I learned all the tricks of the trade that I'm using now to build where I really want to go. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Well, it is not a straight journey ever, is it?
No.
And we don't know what it's going to look like ahead, but you take that first step and then there's a commitment and you just keep stepping. And I've often heard Mark say, there isn't a plan B in the business. You commit and you move forward, and it is out of that commitment that, keeps you moving forward a lot of times. Two things that I wanted to come back to. One, question in the context of the up and downs is I'm curious how that impacted your marriage. So what was that like for you, Cristie, in these up and down times? And you're home with kids. And so
I remember, when he left his company, what I've always known about Doug is that he's just a man of integrity who works hard. And I've always believed, and I still believe, that hard work and integrity is hard to come by. And everyone who's ever come in contact with him in the business world has always said that to me when I show up at Christmas parties or whatever. As his wife, they would sing his praises to me, like, oh, we've worked with Doug on this project or whatever. And so I just believed in him. I just believed that people would want to work with him. And I don't ever remember a time, maybe it was my naivety, I don't know. But I don't ever remember a time like thinking, he's not going to be able to pay our bills. I would do my part. I remember at one point I had a lady that got to clean my house every couple of weeks. And I remember in 2008 telling her, hey, you're not coming back next week because I have to do my part. I cut coupons and did my part financially to help. And like he said, I've the number one volunteer for Martine Consulting at the time, just running all the books and I learned a lot. I learned that a lot of times companies don't pay their invoices in December. That's one I learned. They're busy giving their bonuses. So we learned that very first year, like, hey, December's can be a low month. Okay. And so
good to know. Not comforting, but maybe let you plan the next year or something, buy all your Christmas in November.
Well, in defense of Cristie, I had at my company, I had ownership shares, of course, full paid insurance, a company car, a company credit card. And when I left, it was, all of that got turned in. And so it was to the point of, I have to go buy a car.
Here's another expense.
We really, looking back, I'm like, I can't believe I did that with 2 kids and essentially one on the way with the adoption. And we made that jump at that time in our lives. Yeah. And
also financing an international adoption at the time.
Yes.
It's not inexpensive.
Right.
Is it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. God provided little blessings along the way. I would definitely say I got into real estate at the time.
Okay.
I was doing residential real estate. And so before our daughter came home and even after she came home, I can remember taking her even on some showings with certain clients that were, gracious enough. So I would have a closing here and there. So that helped a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So you were juggling a lot, Cristie.
Yes.
Kids, trying to balance a budget or fill in for maybe months that were low. What was your income like? I'm not asking for dollars, but was it fairly steady from month to month? Did you know what was coming in or?
So like I said, when I first started my company, I had a client base and so that was a pretty steady income because they said, look, here's the work we need you to do. It was basically a monthly fee for that work that they were going to pay me. So we did have a predictable base, I would say, for the first 2 years.
Right.
And that was in about 2008 hit. And that comfortable base had gone away. But I also had enough time to build some relationships in that time. And I guess you could say being in the real estate world could kind of see the storm coming. So I began to prepare for it. I began to diversify before that came.
Very wise.
And so when that base went away, that's when I described, I had 3 or 4 different things coming and cobbled together. That was fine.
Is that what round a cut was also? Yeah. At that time period, I can remember people asking me, what does your husband do for a living? And I remember thinking, well, he runs and roasts coffee. There were some days that he was actually the roaster. I was packaging coffee, and we were making a fee sometimes, not big, but, something off of that, off the investor that was
I was a partner
investing.
In that business, yeah.
And he had a partner that and he had all these myriad of jobs. I just remember saying, I don't really know what he does. It's Martine Consulting. Lots of things.
It has a lot of subsets. And did either of you ever look at each other and go, why are we doing this? Or did you question that decision to jump out on your own and forge your own path?
Nope. I never looked back.
Never looked back.
Down to, I can remember showing up in the parking lot of the company he had left because he had to cash out his ownership shares, and I was going by to pick up the check and drop off any other things that had to be done. He was working, and I think our little girl had just come home because I remember taking her in there to see everybody in the office. And I remember the vice president of the company following me out and asking me if Doug was happy doing what he was doing. And I remember saying, yeah, he seems so happy and content. And him saying, oh, darn, basically he wanted to hire Doug back. And that happened twice along the way. The president of that company actually was at a function that we were at one night, and I sat at the table as that man tried to woo Doug back over and make him some offers and hey, the door is always open. I think, but Doug never.
I never looked back. And I think when it comes to entrepreneurs, I think that's an important thing. 2 points that I'll make is, and I'll take it back to a faith journey. Mm-hmm. I left Egypt. I wasn't going back. I knew what bondage was like. I knew what that discontent was like. And I knew going back, although maybe a financial box could be checked,
right,
I would be back right where I was.
And so,
personally.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so when you didn't look back, what is it that connected or resonated with you as you were moving forward? It sounds
so easy to say, I was doing it, if that makes sense. Like, I set off to start my own business, and I was going out slaying the dragon every day and bringing it home, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And there was a sense of accomplishment in that. And I talk about the ups and downs and cobbling together. It was an exciting time for me, and I think for Cristie.
I remember being in a Bible study at the time, and literally the Bible study that I was in, I would leave my Bible study lesson, and there would be so many things that God would speak to me about that I felt like about our journey that we were on. And I remember calling Doug and saying, this is what God told me today. And it really was just and I would speak to Doug about what I had learned that day that I felt like it was part of our journey at the time. And that was the Christmas season we talk about, because I would say, I prayed for this today. I would pray very specifically, Lord, give him one person to meet today. And then he would call and say, I met this guy today. and it would end up in some sort of business.
Yeah.
The craziest thing.
So affirming.
Yeah.
And I still hear the partnership. It wasn't Doug is going 100%. Off and doing his thing and Cristie's doing her thing, but you're very much partners.
Yeah.
Which I believe,
yes.
It
speaks much to the strength of your marriage today.
Well, there's two things I was going to mention, and I started on one of them, is it wasn't a miserable slug through it time. It was an exciting time because it was almost like, okay, what next? Like, this is fun. I'm doing all these different things. I enjoyed them all because they were all, for the most part, in my realm. And people would often say, hey, what about your company? And I'd be like, it would almost make me sick to my stomach to think of going to work back
really?
At that company.
Really?
So I was saying, I had left Egypt. I knew what Egypt was like. I would rather slug it out in the desert than go back to Egypt all day long.
Yeah.
And because I had friends that still worked there, and it was a constant reminder of how much I enjoyed where I was.
Yeah.
The other thing that you just touched on is, and this is something I ask this question a lot to people saying, hey, I want to start my business. My first question is your wife on board? And if they say, well, I'm like, no. Is she a raving fan?
Have you even talked about it with her?
Is your wife not just okay and willing to go along with it? Is she completely supportive and ready to fight the battle with you? Because if that's not the case, and if you can't check that box, then don't do it. Because the trials will come, period.
Right.
And if your wife felt like you convinced her to do this or drug you into it, or husband, depending on who's starting a business, then it's only going to be resented. And that's when a marriage begins to fragment. In this environment is when,
Absolutely.
if you hadn't have done this, we would have been fine. I said it was in you can imagine where that goes. And so if your wife or spouse is not a raving fan, is what I always say, of you starting a business, then I would caution you to take that step.
Mm-hmm. Enthusiastic agreement. I came across that somewhere, enthusiastic agreement that you talk about. And it's not just like, I guess, but really can you both get on board?
And for me, Doug has always included me in his business. I might not run day-to-day operations. I'm not, but, I have a husband who communicates with me and tells me things that are going on. And I feel like I'm in the know. So I'm a part of it, even if I'm not doing it. I have done it. Like I said, I grinded coffee and packaged coffee and at a roaster. And I'm a nutrition major who did the accounting up until...
Go figure.
I still do all the books for one of his businesses, but I actually did the taxes. That might be scary, for a while. And figured it out and learned it because I wanted to be involved in what he was doing, but he always invited me in to be a part of it. Like I was a teammate. I was his teammate.
Well, for not having read the questions, Cristie, you answered the next question to some degree because I was going to move into some entrepreneur couples have very different perspectives in how much they talk about the business at home. Some people want to keep it very separate. Like work is work and home is home and ne'er the twain shall meet. Mm-hmm. Others talk about it. I know we've had times when it's all we've talked about and we had to put some boundaries around it. But you're saying you were very much a part of it. Mm-hmm. How did the two of you manage that? Did you ever feel like, oh gosh, business is just taking over our lives? How did you balance that, talking about business and relationship?
That's a good question. So the way I handled it is I'm a really good strategic planner, visionary. Here's where I'm taking the business. She was always included in those conversations. Yeah. Here's what's going on. Here's where I'm headed. Okay. Here's what I'm doing to get there. And so she could weigh in and say, well, I don't know. And she could offer her thoughts to that. I didn't. And it's not because I didn't want to, but I felt like the day-to-day operations, the struggles, the day-to-day calls, I didn't bother her with that. That was more business as usual. I would come home or if I'm working from home, I don't say, man, I did these 12 calls, these emails, this is what happened on the job. I don't bother her with the details because she's got her own issues to deal with. But we talk about where it's going, how we're getting there, strategic planning, where we are financially. Those are the things we talk about. So she always... in my opinion, you can answer it, always felt like I wanted her to know, I've got this, I've got a plan, here's where it's going.
And to know where we're going.
And to know where we're going.
Where are we hoping this takes us, those plans can adjust.
She didn't necessarily need to know how the sausage was made, but she wanted to know that I was going to eat. Yeah. And if she asked questions, there were times when I said, hey, here's what's going on today.
Mm-hmm. I would know the big things to pray for. Yeah. And there's a few things I knew more than others, but I knew the vision of the company, or I knew that his vision of where he wanted to go with the company. So
now, vicariously, she got involved in some of the details because she would help me track invoices, and so I would say, have certain client conversations. But I tried to keep that limited so that she didn't carry the burden of the day to day. That was my job. Right. She had the kids to run and in the family, in that side of our life. And I didn't want to burden her with having to help me run a business or take on the burden of the day-to-day struggles. That's my job. Mm-hmm. And so I was careful not to bring that home to her.
Okay. I think we would all agree that good marriages don't just happen. They're the ones that are intentional about developing their relationship. When our daughter was little and I would read her the fairy tales that ended with, and they lived happily ever after. And I would look at her and say, really, they worked very hard at their marriage, and that's why they lived happily ever after. Right. And she would kind of roll her eyes. And as she was approaching marriage, she doesn't remember me giving that ending, but I do remember sharing that with her. What are some things that you have done in your marriage to deepen intimacy, fun, and friendship?
We're both looking at each other. So it is difficult because, and I still maintain that with my business, I don't work till the wee hours in the morning. Like I make it a point to be downstairs for dinner or home for dinner. And the few times that I do travel, I make it a point to do one-day trips there and back in the same day. So I personally make conscious decisions of travel decisions and scheduling meetings to where I'm home.
Okay. And currently your kids are how old, just for context?
Our oldest is a senior. He's 18.
Okay.
And we have a junior who's 16. And then I've got a 7th grader who's 13 and a 5th grader who's 10, almost 11.
Okay. All right.
And so I always made business decisions, whether I didn't take a certain client or a certain project, based on how it was going to take me out of the home. So I think that was the decision I made of I'm going to be a father in my home. I'm going to be a present dad, a present husband.
Not someday I'll have time for this, and then they're grown.
If a job took me out of town 3 or 4 days a week, I just simply wouldn't do it. I mean, I wouldn't accept it.
Okay.
And for that reason. And so that was, for me personally, that was the thing I was not willing to sacrifice ever. And where a lot of people do. You know, a lot of people, and that's a personal decision. I'm not saying it's the right one for everybody. That was my decision. And I think, you know, things for us, it is difficult with 4 kids, all active. It's hard. I think even if I was just with a regular company, I think the things that we do, we make an effort to do date night as much as we can. It doesn't always happen the way we want it to.
We are blessed to have both my parents and Doug's parents who live close. And so when our kids were younger, we would call on my parents and his parents, and even his aunt and uncle, I can remember for a while, readily available, would come and watch the kids so that we could have a date night or go, you know, to a company party or whatever it is to get away. I remember, for Christmases, I remember my mom and dad giving us a gift card to go have an overnight stay at a hotel. That happened on multiple occasions.
So wonderful.
So my parents recognized, my parents were married very young, and they married at 18, and they've been married 50 years this year. His parents as well.
Congratulations to them.
My parents also celebrated their 50th.
Oh, wow.
this
So
year.
you guys had
we have
some
a very
great
supportive family
mentors
and great
also.
mentors. And so I think that I know that that's not a blessing that I would ever overlook because, having a babysitter readily available, and now our children are older. And so now even for our big kids, the other night we wanted to go on a date night, and our 18-year-old son said he'd stay home with the younger two so that we could go have dinner and a movie.
Isn't that fantastic? I remember that time when our oldest was 13 and we trusted him enough to leave with the other two to go get coffee. You know, who knew you needed a teenager's permission for a date night?
I know we have to ask his schedule, but
Well, and I think on a deeper level, her and I, in our entire marriage, her and I have never had, and it should automatically be this way, but I don't think it is in this day and time. We put each other first. And, I know that if I'm doing something, for example, it's why I don't play golf. Because what does golf take? 4 hours on a Saturday and money that I could spend on things for the family. And so I've made a conscious decision growing up. Over the last 15 years, I don't play golf unless it's with her or a family member, if it's a family thing. And so, and that was, we've both been very selfless in our hobbies and the things that we do. That if we have
hobbies are our kids.
Yeah. And
often. We both love what our kids do.
Okay.
I think that we're they're raving fans. So our oldest is a baseball player and has spent his, since he was 9, I think he's played on some sort of select baseball team. So much of our time was during those seasons. The whole family would go to the tournament. We'd all stay in this one little room, huddled up, but
building memories.
And my girls are dancers and dance and compete. And I would say that for me as a wife, I can say that even when I show up to events, Doug is always there, at a dance competition. I mean, when the girls perform at a basketball game and they're going to dance for 2 minutes, he's there. He makes, I can just tell him like, hey, this is what's going on. I can't even think of very many times that Doug's ever missed something of my kids.
It's just on both ends. It's been a very selfless, I guess that's the right word, attitude. Cristie will always say, what's the schedule this week? Well, so-and-so's got X, and I'll say, okay, I'll take here, you take here. And so
divide and conquer.
It is. And I think that's been a mutual thing for her and I, because I can easily say, well, I haven't had my guy time. Right. Or vice versa. And we're not like that. And any time I've asked or she's asked to say, hey, girls' weekend, I'm like, just go. I'll figure it out. And vice versa.
So you put a lot of deposits in the bank.
Yeah. And
to
it's just an attitude,
when you need that time.
And we always, whatever we can do, even if it's like, hey, let's drop what we're doing. Canyon's home. Let's go grab some fajitas together, just to sit at a dinner table together and drive in the car together. Driving over here together by ourselves is kind of cool.
Nice. I'm glad that worked out.
But it's just, you have to find the cracks in time, and it's very selfless attitude towards each other. Because we've known a lot of people that it's like, I want my me time. I want my man cave. And that's never been either of our attitudes.
Yes. And this is a season. This season
Correct.
Won't always be.
Right.
Empty nest is coming.
Right around the corner.
It's a little farther down the road, but your youngest is 10, you said? But it'll be here before you know it. And I think that's one of the things that prompted me to talk with you guys about coming on the show, because that's what Mark has shared with me, is that you guys have made family a priority. I think so often in the business world, we kind of glorify people that sacrifice everything for their business. But what have you gained if, I think about Steve Jobs. He was brilliant, and I love all my Apple products. But when he died, his family was a shambles. According to his biography. Right. And so I'm just very passionate about finding those couples that are finding ways to have success in their growing their own business without sacrificing their family. And I think you guys are doing a magnificent job. What do you know now in business and or marriage that you wish you'd known earlier?
So from a business perspective, it's always going to take longer and be more expensive than what you budgeted. Always.
I think that's
Always.
That's across the board in life.
And so nothing is as easy as people make it out to be. Nothing's as easy as it seems. And your best characteristic better be perseverance. And if you're not willing to persevere, then you need to second guess your decision. And that comes with preparation. If you're in debt and struggling financially, maybe you shouldn't start a business. And we prepared for that as well. If we prepare yourself financially, I would recommend prepare your marriage. If you're going to start a business, have a conversation with your spouse. Again, making sure she's a raving fan. Have the conversations up front about what travel you can anticipate, what kind of income specifically you can anticipate, and have a tier of things. Okay, if it gets hard, what are we going to drop? Are we going to sell the car? Or are we going to move houses? You just need to be prepared. And it goes back to, if you and your wife are both on the same page, or both spouses are on the same page, with persevering financially, persevering in a marriage, persevering personally at the business. If you go into it with that attitude, you'll be more ready for the struggle. I think a lot of people think it's sunshines and rainbows. I'm going to start a business, start making money. I'm going to go buy my new company truck, and I'm going to run off in the sunset. And it's never like that.
Or they look at you at the point where you are now
Yes.
and say, it must be nice. We have heard that so many times. Well, it must be nice. And it's like, oh my goodness, there is much that went into getting to this
And
point.
it's when people say, man, you're an overnight success. I know after 20 years, it's an overnight success. And by no means have we reached that. And that's the other thing I'll say. Cristie and I just had this conversation of when you're starting a business, you're always looking for a threshold moment to celebrate. Like, I joke because it was given to me by a friend, but it's probably a 100-year bottle of something
I
that
don't know,
I
it
have.
was like Dom Perignon or something.
And so I keep telling my partner, hey, at some point we're going to break once we hit that threshold moment. And a couple of years later, we've still never done it. And so what I've learned is that you never have that moment. You've never, quote, arrived.
Right.
It's a slow build. It's a culmination of small events done correctly that builds what you see today. And so my advice would be celebrate the small things. Look back, like when you have small victories, when you get an investor on board, you win one small client, celebrate. Because if you wait for the big moment, that moment's just never going to happen.
Right.
And so we struggle with that, where we've got all these ideas to celebrate, and we look back, we've never done it.
Oh, my goodness.
Or you might be waiting a long time.
Yeah. Right.
And it goes back to the joy is in the journey, not in the accomplishment. And the things that we've learned over the last, as a marriage,
I would say too that a business is, I guess there are businesses that you look at and say, oh, well, they've arrived, and it's just the day-to-day running of a business. In Doug's, I think, line of work and the business he's in, I would say that it's a continual journey. I don't think that he's ever, and I know that in my heart, like, I don't think that we're ever going to get to a place where, like, I've arrived. He's constantly strategic planning the next, because he's got to prepare for not this year, but next year, and getting those clients and doing those things for the next year and 2 years. That's why I can trust him, though, is that I know that he is planning ahead.
You have quite a track record at this point, too.
Yeah, and
helps with that.
But I would say, when you're saying, I wish you would have known, I think the Lord prepared us. But if I were to speak to somebody as a wife, I look at how God prepared things in our life for this. We didn't know why, but both our adoptions being financially costly, we got onto Dave Ramsey pretty young. My kids joke around with the fact that when they were young, they would always listen to it on the radio.
Oh, really?
And I'd pick them up every time I was driving. I had his show on the air and things like that, and so we started doing like cash envelopes really because of that first adoption. We had to figure out how we were going to come up with these finances. And so we learned to not spend more than we made. We learned to live in a budget. We've learned to put things aside and kind of sacrifice for that. And I think that because of that, when we hit where we were in a business and we were doing that as a wife, like I had already learned how to do that. I'd already had to do that in one journey. And, I got to see 2 years later the result of that, my child coming home. But I knew that this was just a different journey and that we were going to continue doing that. And so even today, even this month, as we prepare, Christmas or our first kid going off to college, he's had situations where, while he's working on one business and we call it the manna, where he's working on one part of the business is paying us and we can live. There's parts of the business that he may work 2 and 3 years and not see an income on. And I think because we've been able to budget and learn about our finances and not expend more than we ever had, we were planners, I guess.
Yes. And like you said, the what you learn layers into the future, and even as you're planning business, as your business grows, there are opportunities that you couldn't have anticipated at the beginning. So how do you possibly plan it out 10 or 20 years?
Right.
And I think it's interesting, Doug, hearing more of your story and how you were that kind of traditional path to retirement. Curious now, do you ever see yourself retiring?
No, I'll never retire because I love what I do.
And I want to thank you both so much. I kind of feel like there might be another conversation or two in the future. I know we spoke briefly about the adoption journey, and that is a very can be very challenging and fulfilling at the same time. And just more even about your business, but because I really want to focus on kind of that intersection of marriage and business, I thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts and your journey with us, and for being vulnerable. It's a place that is sometimes hard for us to share that story, but I really, really appreciate it, and I think it's I'm trusting that it's going to be a story that other couples need to hear, because sometimes it can be kind of lonely. That was our experience. We didn't know anybody else that was doing this crazy entrepreneur thing. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to listen to more episodes or to find lots of great resources to grow your marriage, go to kathyrushing.com. That's Kathy with a K. You can also find the podcast wherever you sign up to listen to podcasts. I'll see you next time.